Hello, everyone. Happy week 4. My scholarly article review this week is on an article called Certain Tendencies in Criticism of Shakespeare on Film. It's by Richard Burt and Scott Newstock. And as you can tell from the title, it is all about Shakespeare and specifically the criticism of Shakespeare in literature. So the authors argue that we can no longer criticize Shakespearean text without looking at it through a lens of film. So what they're saying is there are many adaptations of Shakespeare's plays. I'm sure we've all seen them, and there are a lot of interpretations based on Shakespeare in film, such as She's the Man, 10 Things I Hate About You. I'm sure those are all movies that we've seen. But basically, because of these new versions of Shakespeare text, it's made it a lot harder for literary critics to actually critique Shakespeare's work because without taking those films into consideration in their criticism. So basically, they're arguing that pop culture has really affected the way people look at Shakespeare in literary criticism. And part of the article, they talk about how this exactly happened. So they talk about what they call spectral history. And basically, we know that the study of Shakespeare has pretty much been something since the beginning of literary criticism. It's a longstanding tradition in US universities. But during the 60s and 70s, when film started to be really considered this form of art that you could look at critically, film studies became popular in academia. And just because film studies and English seem to go really hand in hand together, the film studies departments kind of just became an extension of English departments in academia. And interesting enough, they point out that Shakespeare professors a lot of times launched film courses just because their area of study with Shakespeare lent itself well to film. But because all this happened around this time, Shakespeare started to get lost in film studies. So their argument is really about this literature versus film in criticism thing. So they argue that theory doesn't translate well across multiple Shakespearean films. So when you think about it, you know, every movie that's been based off of a Shakespeare work has had a different director, a different screenwriter, different actors are in it. And so just by nature, that is every adaptation is going to be a little bit different, and it's going to be based on those people's kind of understanding of that Shakespeare work. So because all of those film adaptations are so different, it's really hard to have a single theory that you can string through all of them. Kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum, Shakespeare text can encompass a single theory because we know it all came from the same source. And when literature and film work as one idea of Shakespeare, theory arguments are usually not as strong. So going back to their original point of it's hard to separate literature and film when it comes to Shakespeare. The downside of that is that when you're trying to compare the two and make a critical statement about Shakespeare's work, it's not a very strong argument when you're looking at both literature and film. And they also point out that film cannot be read as a text, meaning that obviously film and literature are two very different mediums. And although, like we said, they go together really well, especially in academia, they still have very different elements that make them unique. So that's the first half of the article. And the second half of the article takes a little bit of a shift, and it talks about Quentin Tarantino's Inglourious Bastards, which, for those of you who are thinking, oh, that seems like kind of out of the blue, it kind of is. But they argue that Inglourious Bastards has this sort of double meaning. The film doesn't necessarily have a linear history. And as a result, it exemplifies the idea of Shakespeare theory more focused on film influence rather than text. So they talk about Tarantino in his work beyond just Inglorious Bastards, he is obviously very influenced by other filmmakers and other films. And you can see that, the authors say you can see that in Inglorious Bastards, especially with the backdrop being World War II, because instead of maybe reading what really happened during the war in a history book, Tarantino was more obsessed with the influence of the war as seen in film. So, and as we know, film dramatizes things that happen in real life. So there's kind of that disconnect between the two. So, as far as my review of this article goes, I was actually really excited when I found it on the MSU website because I'm very interested in the exact idea it's talking about with literature and film studies and kind of how they connect. And I think after this program at MSU, if I were to do a PhD, it would probably be somewhere in the pop culture literature field. So I was really excited to read this one, and I thought their argument about Shakespeare text and the study of Shakespeare in film and how they're intertwined now because of how pop culture has shaped our view of Shakespeare was um, really interesting. And I kind of put on this slide my own example of Hamlet and The Lion King. The Lion King came out, when I was like 4, and it was my absolute world for like a better half of a decade. So even though I've read Hamlet, I've seen different adaptations of it. Whenever I hear Hamlet, I think, oh my gosh, The Lion King. So I definitely could relate to their idea that like we can't really separate the two now because Shakespeare is just all over pop culture. And I also thought it was interesting that they said the criticism of film cannot be done as if it's a criticism of text and vice versa. Because, like I said, although they go hand in hand, they are very, very different things, and they have very different elements that make them unique. And we need to, when we're criticizing them, we do need to treat them differently. As far as the tie-in with Inglorious Bastards in this article, I was excited when I saw it in the description when I was looking for articles because I thought, well, that's kind of out of the blue, a little random. I'm sure like the tie-in is really interesting. But to be honest, I didn't really know if I felt strongly about the tie-in. It kind of seemed, quite frankly, like random. I think the reason they included this movie was because they talked a lot about the influence that World War II films had on Inglourious Bastards and also the look at Nazis in film. And so I think their argument is more of a parallel where they're saying, Shakespeare criticism cannot be looked at without the how it was shaped by film adaptations, and in the same way, *Inglourious Bastards* was shaped by film adaptations of World War II and interpretations of Nazi Germany. And although I understand the parallel, it kind of seemed like a jump for me because they really, in the second half of the article, stopped talking about Shakespeare altogether and just talked about this idea that old movies basically influenced *Inglourious Bastards*. And it seemed, I don't know, it seemed kind of simple for this type of article. And it, again, didn't really mention any tie-in there with Shakespeare. So it was a little lost on me. So just kind of as a few closing statements, I think my suggestions for this article to make it a little stronger of an argument would maybe be to look specifically at Hamlet's influence on modern film. The authors spent a lot of time talking about Hamlet in *Inglourious Bastards* because they actually, in the movie, mention Hamlet, and I think it's literally just one line in the movie, but they kind of talked about that correlation, and it made me think about Hamlet and how many elements in modern storytelling are probably influenced by that play. So I thought maybe it would have been an interesting way to go to actually look at that specific play and how all of its different modern adaptations have shaped the criticism of the original text of the play in today. And then I really liked their argument about how you can't compare all these different Shakespeare films to one another because they all have different sources and are very different interpretations of his original work. So I kind of wish they would have shown more examples of that lack of the Shakespeare influenced film. I mean, they could have, talked about 10 Things I Hate About You. I know I've already mentioned that one, and a bunch of others, and they could have kind of shown that that argument that they're all connected is a really weak argument. So I think that would have been maybe more of a compelling second half of the article. So um, overall, it was a really, really interesting read, and I'm glad I did read it. If you have any questions about the article at all, please feel free to throw them in the discussion board post this week. And thanks so much for listening.